The moment I set foot on my grandfather's old farm, I knew things weren't going to go as smoothly as I'd hoped. I had imagined my retirement would be peaceful. Just me, the open fields, the sound of wind rustling through the trees. But as I stepped out of my pickup, a woman in her 50s, impeccably groomed with perfectly coiffed blonde hair, stepped into my path. She looked like the kind of person who'd make a scene over a missing grocery coupon. And here she was, glaring at me like I'd just desecrated her sacred territory. "You can't just waltz in here like you own the place," she snapped, blocking the entrance to the property. "This is a regulated community. We have standards." Before I could respond, she whipped out her phone with a flourish, the way someone might unsheath a sword. "I'm calling the cops. This is trespassing, and I won't tolerate it." I set down my box, taking a deep breath. "Ma'am, I think there's been a misunderstanding. I'm Dylan Carter. This is my property. I inherited it from my grandfather, Robert Carter." She didn't flinch. Instead, she gave me a laugh that grated on my nerves, like nails scratching a chalkboard. "Oh, please. Do you think I was born yesterday? I'm Brenda Thornfield, president of the Meadowbrook Heights Homeowners Association. I know every property transaction in this area. This land falls under HOA jurisdiction. You're trespassing." I had dealt with arrogant people before, but something about her was different, too prepared, too rehearsed. Most neighbors would be curious about the new guy, maybe bring a casserole. But Brenda came armed with paperwork and a smug expression like she had been waiting for this exact confrontation. "Mrs. Thornfield," I said, keeping my voice calm, "I understand you're concerned about property management, but I assure you everything is legitimate. Perhaps we could discuss this calmly." I pulled out my phone, not to call anyone, but to start recording. One of my better habits from years of handling dangerous situations. Her face reddened, and she stepped closer, trying to intimidate me. "Don't patronize me, young man. I've been protecting this community for 7 years, keeping out undesirables, drug dealers, criminals, and now I'm dealing with you." I met her glare with a steady gaze. "I understand your position, but I need to see the documentation for this HOA jurisdiction you're claiming. According to my deed and county records, this property is privately owned." I watched her carefully. The briefest flicker of panic flashed across her face, but she quickly regained her composure. That's when I noticed the security cameras. They were old, probably installed by my grandfather decades ago, but the red lights indicated they were still recording. Grandpa had always been paranoid about security, and now I was starting to see why. Brenda dialed the sheriff, her voice dripping with urgency as she called for backup. 5 minutes later, a patrol car pulled up. The sheriff, a heavy-set man in his late 40s, stepped out with a look that suggested he'd much rather be writing speeding tickets than dealing with whatever this was. "What seems to be the problem here, Mrs. Thornfield?" the sheriff asked, already sounding tired. Brenda handed him the paperwork with a flourish. "This man is trespassing on HOA property," she said, her voice oozing with righteous indignation. "I've asked him to leave multiple times, and he's refused." The sheriff glanced at the papers, then turned to me. "Sir, can I see some identification and proof that you have the right to be here?" I reached into my jacket slowly, the motion deliberate. "Sheriff, I have my driver's license, the property deed, and my grandfather's will, which transferred ownership to me." I handed over the folder, and the sheriff flipped through the documents. As he did, I watched Brenda closely. Her face twisted in confusion, her lips moving slightly as she tried to process what was happening. Finally, the sheriff nodded. "These documents appear to be in order," he said, glancing at Brenda. "Mrs. Thornfield, I'm not seeing any HOA jurisdiction over this property. Perhaps there's been some confusion in your records." Brenda's face shifted through several shades of red, finally settling on a deep purple. "That's impossible," she hissed. "I checked everything." "Maybe you should check again," I muttered under my breath, though I knew I was pushing it. With a look of finality, the sheriff turned and walked back to his patrol car. Brenda stood there, clutching her paperwork like a security blanket. She didn't look defeated. She looked scared. As I watched her drive away in her pristine white Mercedes, I realized this wasn't over. It had barely begun. The next morning, barely before I finished my coffee, I heard the unmistakable sound of car doors slamming outside. Through the kitchen window, I saw Sheriff Williams again, But this time, he was flanked by two deputies. Brenda stood by her car, arms crossed, a triumphant smile on her face. "Mr. Carter," the sheriff called, his tone formal, "we need to have another discussion about your presence on this property." I stepped out onto the porch, already sensing something was wrong. The deputies were positioned strategically, and Brenda was holding up a new set of documents. "We've discovered discrepancies in your documentation, Mr. Carter," Brenda said, her voice almost smug now. "We've also received reports that you may be engaging in surveillance activities against the neighborhood." The words hit me like a slap in the face. Surveillance? That was ridiculous. The only surveillance here was the cameras my grandfather had installed decades ago. But I kept my voice calm. "Sheriff," I said, keeping my tone steady, "I'm happy to cooperate, but I'd like to see the legal basis for these claims." "You're welcome to search the property, but I need to see a warrant first. And these alleged discrepancies in my documents, can you be more specific?" Brenda's expression faltered for a moment, but she quickly regained her confidence. "These documents show HOA jurisdiction over this property," she said, "and we have evidence that you've been recording private conversations without consent." I glanced at the documents Brenda had presented. The signatures looked suspiciously similar to her handwriting, and the paper quality was the same as the documents she had shown me the day before. I took a deep breath. "Sheriff," I said, "I think you need to look more closely at these documents. The signatures are questionable, and the language is inconsistent. These aren't the legitimate documents you think they are." The sheriff shifted uncomfortably, finally nodding. "Perhaps we need to step back and review this more carefully." I smiled inwardly as I saw Brenda's confidence begin to unravel. Later that day, Ruby Patterson, a neighbor I'd never met, stopped by. Her timing was far too convenient, but when she told me that Brenda had been systematically targeting elderly residents, I began to understand just how deep the corruption ran. "Your grandfather fought against her for years," Ruby told me, her voice low. "She's been trying to get people to sell their land for pennies on the dollar. Your grandfather was the one who exposed her. That's why she's after this property." Ruby's words hit me like a freight train. The pieces were finally falling into place. My grandfather had been fighting a much larger battle than I'd ever imagined, and Brenda was only a small part of it. That night, as I sifted through my grandfather's belongings, I found something I wasn't expecting. A set of documents that showed the real value of the land, not just in terms of its size, but in what was hidden beneath it. This property wasn't just farmland, it was something much more valuable. Something worth killing for. I had no idea what Brenda's next move would be, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't backing down. And if she thought she could scare me off with a few threats, she was gravely mistaken. The real battle was just beginning.